hours can cut ensuing damage by 30%. Early warning is just a part of the pie called disaster risk reduction. In fact, India's G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant has said that the constitution of a new working group on disaster risk reduction will be India's unique contribution as G20 president. India, under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has come up with path-breaking global initiatives like CDRI, or Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and IRIS, or Infrastructure for Resilient Island States. He has also outlined a 10-point action plan on DRR, which we will share shortly with you. On India at G20 today, we ask, can India use its expertise, experience and best practices at the local, national and international levels to help G20 mainstream disaster risk reduction in its agenda and accelerate financing for it? I'm Manu Bhattacharya. First up, the top stories. India's chief coordinator for G20, Harshvardhan Shringla, meets officials from embassies of Japan and Sweden in India to explore opportunities of cooperation in health, education, digital transformation within G20 framework as G20 under India's presidency continues its proactive outreach to its members and invitees. Japanese ambassador to India, Hiroshi Suzuki, congratulates India for its G20 presidency, says the world will be focused on how New Delhi will preside over the important body. Promises Japan's support to India, says India's friend Japan stands ready to cooperate as much as possible for its great success. As G20 President, India outlines priorities of finance track, focus on reorienting international financial institutions to meet 21st century challenges, financing cities of tomorrow, managing global debt vulnerabilities, financing for climate action and SDGs, and globally coordinated approach to unbacked crypto assets. As G20 president, India is not only offering continuity but is also adding substance to what has been achieved under the G20 framework over the years. A new working group on disaster risk reduction will be India's unique contribution as G20 president. In fact, India has been pulling out all stops to help those countries that are most vulnerable to disasters, including climate change. Here's more.
India's G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant has termed the constitution of a new working group on disaster risk reduction as the unique contribution of India's G20 presidency. While addressing a media briefing recently, he said, a new work stream on disaster risk reduction has been established under India's presidency to encourage collective work, multidisciplinary research and exchange of best practices on disaster risk reduction. In fact, India, under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has been leading from the front at the global level in the domain of building disaster risk resilience. In 2019, at the UN Climate Action Summit in New York, Prime Minister Narendra Modi launched an international partnership, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, or CDRI, with the aim of helping build infrastructure around the world that is resilient to natural disasters.
वैश्विक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर नेचुरल डिजास्टर्स का सामना कर सके, इसके लिए भारत कोएलिशन फॉर डिजास्टर रेजिस्टेंट इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर की शुरुआत कर रहा है। मैं सभी मेंबर स्टेट्स को इससे जुड़ने के लिए आमंत्रित करता हूं।
In November 2022, at the COP27 summit at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, CDRI announced a $50 million or approximately 400 crore rupees trust fund to fund disaster-resilient infrastructure systems in developing countries and island nations, which face the greatest threats from climate change. The fund is called the Infrastructure Resilience Accelerator Fund, or IRAF, supported by the governments of India, the United Kingdom, Australia and the European Union. Earlier, in November 2021, PM Modi launched Infrastructure for Resilient Island States, or IRIS, or IRIS, at COP26 in Glasgow in Scotland, for developing infrastructure for small island nations.
Infrastructure for Resilient Island States, IRIS, का लॉन्च एक नई आशा जगाता है, नया विश्वास देता है। ये सबसे वल्नरेबल देशों के लिए कुछ करने का संतोष देता है। क्लाइमेट चेंज से सबसे अधिक खतरा स्मॉल आइलैंड डेवलपिंग स्टेट्स सीड्स को है। ये उनके लिए जीवन मृत्यु की बात है।
The G20 Bali Declaration in November underscored deep concern over how multidimensional crises including the COVID-19 pandemic, lack of fiscal space and unequal access to finance and technology are posing significant challenges towards realizing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda in a timely manner. It agreed to take concrete and ambitious actions to strengthen inclusive and sustainable recovery and build resilience in all developing countries, including small island developing states or SIDS or SIDS in the Pacific and Caribbean, and least developed countries or LDCs. It reiterated support to Africa, including through the G20 Compact with Africa and the G20 Initiative on supporting industrialization in Africa and least developed countries. It recognized the need for inclusive and quality infrastructure investment for stronger recovery and resilience, and the need to address financing gap towards implementation of the 2030 Agenda by enhancing innovative financing mechanisms, including blending finance, while noting the importance of transparency and mutual accountability. New working group on disaster risk reduction is expected to offer a more focused approach on DRR under the G20 framework. Bureau Report, DD India.
Out with a 10-point action plan on disaster risk reduction. What are those 10 points and why they are important in the G20 framework as well? Let's understand that. Well, the first point is that all development sectors must imbibe principles of disaster risk management. So disaster risk management has to be an integral part of planning across sectors. Risk coverage must include all poor households, SMEs, multinational corporations and nation states. No stakeholder should be left behind. Women's leadership and greater involvement must be central to disaster risk management. So we should have more women artisans, more women engineers. Central role of women. Invest in risk mapping globally to improve global understanding of nature and disaster risk. So we need for assessment that risk mapping to take place. Leverage technology to enhance efficiency of disaster risk management efforts. Early warning systems is one technology which is being referred to here. Develop network of universities to work on disaster related issues. So network of specialized universities should be developed. Utilize opportunities provided by social media and mobile technologies for disaster risk reduction to ensure that there's greater participation at the community level, particularly in awareness creation and disaster response. Build on local capacity and initiative to enhance disaster risk reduction. So include traditional indigenous practices as well. Learn from disasters by conducting studies on lessons after every disaster. This is extremely important. Documentation of lessons needs to be done. Bring a greater cohesion in international response to disasters. This can be made possible through greater international collaboration. G20 can be one such instrument. Let's get perspective now from our guests. Joining us are Kamal Kishore, Member Secretary, NDMA, and joining us from Tokyo is Professor Rajiv Shaw. He is a professor with Kyoto University in Japan. He's a recipient of the UN Sasakawa Award for disaster risk reduction in 2022 for his lifetime contribution in the field of disaster risk reduction. Sasakawa Award is the highest UN award for disaster risk reduction. Such a pleasure to have the two distinguished gentlemen on the show this evening. Mr. Kishore, I'll begin with you. I was looking at the casualty figures of the 1999 super cyclone in Odisha and that of the Bhuj earthquake and of the recent cyclones in India, and there's a huge difference. For instance, in the 1999 cyclone, around 30,000 people lost their lives. However, now we are very close to achieving the zero casualty figure. In fact, in some cases, we already have achieved that. There is a 90% decline in death toll in cyclones compared to how the situation was 15 years back in India. So India has a lot of experience and expertise to offer on a platform like G20. How has India achieved that, and how can India contribute at this platform? We cannot hear you. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, indeed, for some of those disasters, such as cyclones and more recently heat waves, India has made a lot of progress, particularly when it comes to reducing these loss of lives. As you highlighted, in case of cyclones, in the last 15 years, we've reduced mortality by 95 to 98%. But when you ask me, how have we achieved it? I would say there are three elements to our success story. The first is that, we have made huge progress in improving our forecast and warning. If you see how good our forecast has become with regards to where landfall of a cyclone will occur, what will be the wind speed, lead time for predicting the area where the landfall will occur. I think there has been a complete sea change from how it was 15 years ago. So huge improvement in forecasting and warning. The second and very important bit is that community level preparedness. It is one thing to have one thing to have good warning. It is quite another thing to have preparedness at the local community level so that people know what to do with that warning. We run the world's largest national cyclone risk mitigation program, where when you receive a warning, people off the coast of Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, they know what to do with it in a very organized way. Through community organization, they move to cyclone shelters and stay there till the cyclone passes. So that has helped us save lives. And the third thing is that our dissemination systems are improving continuously. At this moment, we are also implementing a common alerting protocol, which will further strengthen the dissemination of early warning systems. So these three things: improvement in warning and forecasting and warning, community-based preparedness to act on that warning, and strengthening of dissemination systems has really helped us bring down the loss of lives by 2 orders of magnitude.
So use of technology, dissemination systems, as well as participation of communities as a whole has been something which India is extremely proud of, because that has given dividends as far as disaster risk management, prevention, resilience and reduction is concerned. Professor, I'll come to you now. Only today we heard from the Japanese ambassador to India, who's offered wholehearted support to India, which is the G20 president. And there is a lot of expertise and experience that Japan has in the field of disaster risk reduction and resilience, because it is prone to a lot of natural disasters, cyclones, earthquakes, etc. Can India and Japan make for a win-win partnership under the G20 framework when it comes to disaster risk reduction?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think first I should like to congratulate Government of India for bringing these very important issues in the G20 officially with the working group. G20 and disasters, it's not new, means we have been discussing this for the last almost 10 years. 2012, when Mexico has its presidency, there were some emphasis. 2019, when Japan had the presidency, there were also some attempt, but I think this is the formal working group which has been formed this time on the disaster risk reduction. So I think that's a very, very good attempt. And of course, like Japan and India being 2 major countries which has long histories of disasters, which have long histories of risk reduction approaches, which has also long history of people's resilience. I think if Japan and India comes together and make the proper leadership in this G20 for this disaster risk reduction, I think definitely it will be a very, very strong attempt. And the way my colleague of NDMA's Kamal Kishore, who is a good friend, he very eloquently actually explained about India's disaster risk reduction approaches. And I also see that India is possibly one of the very few countries in the world which use the Disaster Management Act when addressing the pandemic. Like we have been discussing this for many years, that this type of biological hazard should also be considered under the overall disaster risk reduction framework. But India had actually showed that how an act can be implemented with this huge, big population. And I think that is a very strong leadership of the governance. And as we know that the disaster is a very complex phenomena of this decision making at different levels, at the national level, at the state level, at the district level, community level. So in this whole complex phenomena, the leadership, I think, which India has shown, that's great. And of course, in Japan, having the repeated disasters, the last major one, I will say, was the 2011 East Japan earthquake and tsunami 10 years back. And with all the accumulative knowledge and wisdom, I think we can make a difference.
Right. I'll come to you now, Mr. Kishore. I was going through the Bali Declaration, and there is a reference to how there is a financing gap, and that there can be use of innovative financing mechanisms. Also, there's a mention of blended finance, there's a mention of CDRI. In fact, a professor here is closely associated with CDRI. But Mr. Kishore, how can, under India's presidency, we take this particular domain forward? How can we add substance to what has already been achieved?
Thank you for that question. Under the G20 presidency that we are holding now on disaster risk reduction, we have proposed to begin the conversation 5 priorities. And one of the key priorities is around financing. You know, the world has been talking about increasing investments in disaster risk reduction, but only a small fraction of disaster management funding goes to risk reduction. Most of it goes to disaster response. We want to work towards a world where this whole thing is reversed, where we invest more in risk reduction so that we don't have to spend on disaster response. So it's really a key priority for us, and we can do that with some credibility because at home, as a follow-on to the recommendations of 15th Finance Commission, we have a large pot of money that we have allocated for disaster risk reduction. We call it disaster risk mitigation. It's about $1 billion every year for the entire country. You know, India is one of the few countries that have dedicated financing for disaster risk reduction of this magnitude. We need to increase it even more, and other countries also need to do more. You know, if we are serious about making the paradigm shift from relief to risk reduction, then that paradigm shift has to be reflected in how we put money, where we put money. So that's really one of the key priorities we have. Of course, it is not just the public finance, it's not just the public sector financing. We also have to see, you mentioned blended finance, we have to see how we can encourage private sector to put resources in disaster risk reduction. We also have to see how do we include risk finance, insurance instruments, create risk pools to also support disaster risk reduction efforts globally. So this is really going to be one of the key priorities, one of the 5 priorities that we are going to put forward. Of course, G20 is a consensus-based forum. We have to rally support for these ideas, but this is clearly one of the main 5 pillars, one of the 5 pillars of our strategy on disaster risk reduction within the G20 framework.
Right. Professor, how has Japan coped with so many disasters, particularly the 2011 earthquake? What is the mantra with which it goes ahead? And as someone who is an expert when it comes to community-based risk management, how important is the role of communities?
Thank you. I think that's a very, very important point which you have raised. And I always say that Japan's strength on disaster risk reduction is the resilience of the people of Japan. And it's very much rooted in the communities and the people. Like the traditional voluntarism, the spirit of voluntarism during disasters, I think that's a very, very important aspect. And it has been there for over years. And I think the role of disaster volunteers in different aspects of the disaster, whether it is the pre, during, and the post-disasters, is very important. And we have seen that how this whole spirit of voluntarism coming up very strongly. Another aspect is the civil society. In many places, I think lots of local grassroots community-based organizations, they are extremely rooted and very motivated to cope with different types of disasters. And each and every disaster shows us new learning opportunities and the new thing which we actually bring in future. So that's one aspect of the community and the grassroots organizations. But also, as you know, that the whole structure of different types of risk, what we call the risk landscape, is changing. What was there possibly 10 years, 20 years back, and what is currently happening or what will be possibly happening in future is quite different. And in that way, Japan is also strongly focusing on different types of what we call the disruptive technologies or emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, robotics, big data, drones, and so on. And there again, like it's of course it's the evolution of the technology in one part, but also how the governance structure actually changes to cope with or to adopt or to apply those new technologies.
Right.
So one is that community part is very important for Japan, but also to focus on this type of new and disruptive technologies and try to do it more new innovations in this aspect.
Right.
That's also very, very important.
Absolutely. So those are some lessons that the world can learn from Japan's experience, just like India has a lot of experience to offer to the world in this domain. Now, Mr. Kishore, towards the end, I want to ask you about how the 10-point action plan of Prime Minister Narendra Modi on DRR can be critical in the context of G20 as well, because 2023 is also the year when the midterm review of the Sendai framework will take place. And are we really on target? Is the world on target on achieving the targets of the Sendai framework? Do you expect that to be mentioned in the final G20 communique after the Leaders Summit in September next year?
Thank you. I would say that Prime Minister's 10-point agenda for disaster risk reduction, which he articulated at the Asian Ministerial Conference that we hosted in 2016, is the guiding light for a lot of the work that we do at home as well as internationally, a lot of what we want to do within the G20 framework as well. So if you look at point 1, which talks about how do you go about integrating disaster risk reduction in all development sectors, in all investments. So if you look at that and you look at what we're trying to do under G20, one of the 5 priorities is to work on resilient infrastructure. We want to promote the notion that any infrastructure that we build it not for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, but multiple decades, and it should be able to withstand disasters that might happen over those multiple years. Professor Rajiv Shaw, a good friend and colleague for decades now, talked about how Japan uses technology. You have prime ministers under Prime Minister's 10-point agenda, a whole section on bringing in, mobilizing the power of technology, including social media, including other technologies to work on disaster risk reduction. This is again one of the things that is embedded in the framework that we're proposing for disaster risk reduction within G20. Now, you're talking about progress. It is indeed very timely, the establishment of this working group. It happens at a time when we are engaged in midterm review of Sendai framework. In Sendai framework, we have 7 targets. 4 are related to reducing losses, reducing the loss of lives, number of affected people, economic losses, infrastructure losses. 3 are related to increasing capacities, having more plans and strategies, better access to early warning systems, and having more international financing, international cooperation in disaster risk reduction. I think it would be fair to say that at least in 4 or 5 of these, we have not made adequate progress. Humanity hasn't made adequate progress in the last 7-8 years. In fact, in some parts of the world, the progress has not just plateaued, it has actually reversed. We really want to use the conversation in G20 to give a sense of urgency to the implementation of Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction.
Right, we'll leave it at that. You expect urgency on the issue of acting on disaster risk reduction and disaster risk resilience, particularly in the interest of small island developing countries, which are the most vulnerable to natural disasters, including climate change. We'll leave it at that. Professor Shaw and Mr. Kishore, such a pleasure to have the two of you on this special broadcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
G20 Chief Coordinator Harshvardhan Shringla met officials from the Embassy of Japan in India and Embassy of Sweden in India. Also, The meeting took place to explore opportunities of cooperation in health, education and digital transformation, to name a few, within the G20 framework. After the conclusion of the meeting, Dr. Harshvardhan Shringla tweeted that with India's G20 presidency, proactive outreach to G20 members and invitees will continue. Congratulating India for its G20 presidency, Japanese ambassador to India Hiroshi Suzuki on Wednesday said that the world will be focused on how New Delhi will preside over this important body. Japanese envoy also added that India's friend Japan stands ready to cooperate as much as possible for its great success. He also batted for synergy between G20 and G7 as Japan will take over the presidency of the G7. As G20 president, India has outlined priorities of the finance track, the focus on reorienting international financial institutions to meet 21st century challenges, financing cities of tomorrow, managing global debt vulnerabilities, financing for climate action and SDGs, and globally coordinated approach to unbacked crypto assets have been mentioned. The priorities also include advancing the taxation agenda and financial inclusion and productivity gains. With that, we come to the close of this edition of India at G20. Thanks for watching.
Youth 20 is going to be our focus, and how young India is going to play a very critical and rather decisive role when it comes to India leading from the front.
One of the most premier engagement group is Youth 20, which we are representing. Working on short-term capacity building within the country and to creating a longer lasting impact that goes beyond just our presidency.
How will success for India's presidency be measured, and what would be the matrix and indicators?
How do you define the position of New Delhi as a new center of opportunities in the Indo-Pacific?
India's time to lead, and definitely it's a lot of it. It's also the youth's time to lead. We are now able to mobilize young people much more, as Palit is saying, across the country, in schools and colleges.
फूल वाला, केटरिंग वाला, बैंड वाला, ये लो भाई।
बैंड बजेगी पापा, अगर गड़बड़ हुई तो गए पैसे।
अरे नहीं रे, बैंक संभाल लेगा।
कैसे?
मैंने पॉजिटिव पे सिस्टम पे रजिस्टर किया है। बैंक को चेक्स और बेनिफिशियरीज की जानकारी दे दी है। बैंक चेक करेगा, जांच करेगा। डिटेल्स मैच नहीं तो क्लियरेंस नहीं।
अच्छा, लाइए मुझे दीजिए। फोटो वाला, लाइट वाला, मंडप वाला।
आरबीआई कहता है
जानकार बनिए, सतर्क रहिए।
बिल्कुल सही कह रहे हैं।